Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, and I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go to teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Lisa Hornschemeier, and she is a VP of engineering with a career spanning software development, enterprise systems, cloud platforms, and engineering leadership. And in our conversation today, we'll discuss how engineering leaders bridge communication gaps across organizations, explain complex technical decisions to diverse stakeholders, and why strong communication skills are essential for engineers who want to lead and provide business impact. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Lisa.
Thank you, Neil.
First question. What communication gaps do you typically see from your vantage point between technical people and non-technical people?
Well, typically in high tech or in software engineering, just in general, regardless of what industry you are developing software in and specializing in software engineering, I would say the common issue typically is technology is very vast and there's a lot of uniqueness in a variety of different pieces of a technological stack, whether it be front end, back end, middleware. And typically in college and our training in our early years as engineers, we start to specialize in one area or another for whatever reason. And when you get into the industry, sometimes you're needed in other parts of a technical stack. And so trying to speak a common language across a large, vast technical area can become complex and challenging because people have different niche skills or specialized skills. So, kind of coming into a discussion where folks have different backgrounds of what they're good at can present some challenges because typically in software engineering, you're creating a product for somebody. And so that product entails all the parts of a technical stack. And being able to drive the right outcome for a customer and how you're developing software, you've got to be good at navigating the breadth of the product as well as the depth of inside the product. I would say, a lot of times leaders, a lot of time, what I've found over the years that really is able to anchor people in a conversation, regardless of the background of tech that they have, is speaking in patterns. So, what are the patterns that we're seeing, and kind of getting to that more philosophical, if you will, issues and problems. And then you bring in the right experts on where the issues are or where the real challenge and complexity is based on the niche or the specialized skills. So kind of trying to abstract the actual technical components to really talk about how we're solving patterns and where the problems are is typically how you can rally and get people, regardless of their technical credentials, into okay, here's the directionality of where we're going. And here are the people that we probably need to bring in because we believe the root cause or the complexity of the real issue that we need to dive into is in this piece of the stack. So let's bring the experts in and kind of unpack that.
In the event that there are these communication gaps, Lisa, what outcomes do you typically see based on those gaps?
So we're specifically talking about maybe in products or with from a people standpoint, Neil.
People standpoint.
Yeah. Um, you know, One of the biggest challenges I face as a leader in trying to get people to come together to solve a problem is the willingness or the initiative that engineers have or don't have to be able to want to be able to be part of the discussion. Um, I try to do a really good job, and sometimes I probably do, and sometimes I can probably do better around making sure I'm bringing inclusive thinking into the discussion. Because just like in our personal lives, we see it in our professional lives. We have people that are very comfortable talking all the time, and then we have people that, I think I know that, but for whatever reason, I'm just going to let these folks talk, and they might have a different perspective that's never heard. that could actually help us tackle a problem in a different way, that's probably the right way and approach. So I would say that from a gap, when we try to solve issues, and you're specifically asking me on gaps of communication, my biggest instinct right now and how I want to answer that is people tend to just personally, regardless of who you are, where you're from, and not anchor themselves in one category or another, being comfortable speaking all the time or choosing to wait and not engage and for whatever reason. And I think that in a room, and when stress is high, or even when stress is not high and we're just all getting paid to do a job, the people that are comfortable talking all the time can tend to remain in that discussion, and we can lose the right edge, the right intel, the right knowledge if we don't bring those folks in that don't have that immediate instinct to talk.
That's interesting you say that because there's been so many instances in which I've been in a meeting, and yes, you do have the talkers and I suppose the non-talkers. And with the talkers, they keep going, and perhaps if you're a non-talker, you don't want to interrupt them, but sometimes some people need to be interrupted because they'll just keep going and they start repeating themselves, and it's just like, are they going to get to a new point? Are they just going to keep saying the same point using different words? And then you have the people who are perhaps non-talkers, and I would put myself in this category actually. And we like to think about things before we say them. Because there are a lot of people who are fine with thinking out loud, and then there are people like myself who don't want to do that. We want to really formulate what we want to say first before we say anything, and then by the time that happens, the meeting's over. So
Exactly.
there's
Yeah,
been
right.
instances of that too. Yeah, yeah. I when you're speaking, I was just thinking about being in meetings back when I worked as an engineer and just hearing somebody say something and just think to myself, they said the same thing like maybe a minute ago. They just use different words.
Yeah. But on that, Neil, if I may, I love how you're kind of like sharing a quick way of saying talkers and non-talkers. So if we stay with those kind of like labels for now, for sake of the discussion, what's interesting is you have to, as a leader, you have to be super careful how you navigate the talkers and the non-talkers. So the goal is to bring non-talkers in more to discussion. But the goal is not necessarily to shut down talkers all the time, because something else. So as you can probably naturally assume, I have grown up to be more of a talker. But the interesting thing is talkers also process through talking, while non-talkers are processing, internalizing by not talking. So the goal is you want both. You want both of those groups thinking. And sometimes the talkers have to talk to think. Right, wrong, or indifferent. That's just how the brain is processing information. And then also that could initiate different exploratory thinking for your internal processors that choose not that don't think out loud, that think internally. So the trick is really how you keep flow of thought going and percolating while not shutting down either category of thinkers. And that perfection of recipe is very, I don't think anyone's mastered. Some meetings go better than others. As I have grown in my role or in my career, I've noticed, so I've been forced just through like professional, self-awareness, I need to talk less in meetings. Just because from an authority perspective, the larger my role gets and the more responsibility or power, if you will, as a leader I get, the more people will stop and listen to what I have to say. And the more scope that I become responsible for, the less of an expert in that scope I become, because my breadth is growing. So I've naturally had to kind of caution myself. I'm an out loud thinker. I've got to find different ways to explore my thinking, because as a leader, the more we talk, the more people will quiet and listen. And that's not necessarily what I want, because I know I'm not the smartest person in the room anymore.
Yeah, that's very self-aware of you to know about yourself. And you're right. Who's going to interrupt the leader? If they're going on, yeah, we're definitely going to listen. And
And if I say something wrong, I mean, more people than not are going to be like, okay, well, maybe she needs us to head down this way. And maybe I don't want that, right? Or I don't know if we should do that, right? So it's all like there's so many complexities of dimensions on that, really.
Oh, 100%. I mean, even when you were talking, Lisa, again, it reminded me of being in meetings. And as I said, I tend to be more of a non-talker. And in some instances, what people will do if you're leading the meeting is they'll call on a non-talker. Neil, what do you have to say? And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I had something to say, I would have said it. I mean,
Right.
I'm not being quiet because I don't think I can talk. A lot of times I'm not saying anything because I'm still thinking about what has already been said and formulating thoughts. And now you're kind of been put on the spot to say something, and it's like, oh man, why you gotta do that to me?
And that's another thing that you are calling attention to as an example where a leader could have good intentions to bring somebody in because they actually want to hear how their brain is thinking for whatever reason, but then it's going to put you off because now it stages you a little bit differently, and it could shut you down in terms of, wait, hey, like that was kind of a weird exchange for me, like I'm not holding back, I just don't really have anything interesting to share at this point in time. And now you're on a stage and you have to navigate how you respond to that,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, absolutely. And now that you mentioned it, what I was thinking about now is there are instances in which there are people that are in meetings and they aren't talkers and they do feel uncomfortable speaking in meetings and they would prefer somebody to say, Neil, what do you think on this topic? And now Neil thinks, okay, now I can speak because someone has invited me into the conversation. But then I was like, again, there's people like me who didn't really want to be invited. They're going to say what they're going to say when they are comfortable enough to say it, but you don't really know who's who, but just by them not saying anything. And
So on this, so it's coming to mind as we have this discussion. COVID in this industry for software engineers has really reset how we work and where we work. So I know some companies are pushing more returned into office and in-person discussions, which are much harder to navigate based on what we've been talking about versus the virtual meeting. Let me share with you really quickly on a tip on how, in a non-threatening way, a leader can engage their team while giving you the space, Neil, to own if you're going to, if now is your time to engage or not, without it being so public. So at Oracle, we are very much virtual, like the flexibility of being virtual anywhere, everywhere, working. And much of our meetings now, all my meetings all day are on Zoom. I work from my home office now all the time. And I'm on Zoom constantly. I have learned, so it requires some multi-threadedness of how you do meeting management that I would highly recommend any leader, frontline manager or high-level leader, that they kind of consider to explore is typically in meetings, especially like kind of more formal meetings, not the casual meetings. Because Neil, you'll probably feel less like staged in a casual team. You're like, oh no, I don't have anything to say. But if it's a little bit of a formal meeting, whether you're trying to get to a definitive decision, or there's some higher level people in the room, or there's even just customers or some stakeholders that are not part of the team that are in this kind of more formal-ish meeting, what I've learned to do, and it's become super effective, is I bring my team in a Slack, like a side chat with the meeting going on. So this is the multi-threadedness. We're not having a conversation in that Slack because we need to be on and focused in the discussion. So it's not a, hey, I'm distracting you exercise, but it's an additional tool, help aid that, for example, let's just say Bob. I know Bob knows this topic really well that's being discussed around the table, but I'm not hearing Bob talk. But I know Bob is, knows more than I do, and probably everyone that's talking about this topic. I'll ping Bob on Slack, or not in the Zoom chat because then everyone can see it, but on Slack on the side channel. And I'll say, hey, Bob, do you want to say anything in this meeting? Because I really think that some of what you are involved with is more interesting, right? So I'll have, and then there are times where like, hey, like, no, this is right. I'm not gonna derail the topic. It's going in the right direction. I support this. Like I have these conversations with my team, or I'll ask, hey Bob, do you agree with this discussion, how it's going? And he'll be like, no, I don't. And I'm like, okay, well, I want to invite you into this. Is that cool? And then I would find a way. Hey Bob, like what are we thinking here? What are your thoughts on this? So it's like a nice little tool of engagement that allows the non-talkers to feel less threatened or awkward into coming into a discussion where they're invited to share.
That's really smart. I really like that idea. And yes, because it's virtual, you can do that. Perhaps in person, not so
It's
much.
much more difficult. Pre-COVID days when I was in the office 5 days a week, it's much harder. Typically, when I think back to that, gosh, it's been like six years now. But when I think back to those moments, more of the kind of energy read in the room or what the vibe is. So like you can tell if people want like are thinking and want to be part of a discussion. I mean, I'm not always right. I'm not a mind reader. I'm not trying to say that, but typically you can tell by a person's energy or involvement with how they are in a meeting if they want to be more involved versus okay, wait, I'm not. And then if like I remember in the more face-to-face meeting days, if there was some weird vibe, if you will, in a meeting that I caught, I would always do a follow-up offline outside of that meeting, like, hey, what'd you think about that meeting? Like, what are your thoughts? And kind of just poke at it. That's typically how I navigated that. I'll tell you in the virtual world, we are way more productive because you can do that more in line. And if there was something to be said, I can catch it. In the formal meeting face-to-face world, it takes a little bit longer.
That is so interesting you say that, Lisa, because I, well, I know that one of the reasons many are advocating for a return to the office is because they say that productivity will increase. But you're essentially saying, no, productivity increased because Bob was comfortable responding to a Slack that was on virtual, as opposed to being called out into a meeting. Bob, what do you have to say? And now Bob is, stuttering over his words because Bob wasn't prepared to say anything. That's an interesting point. I don't think I've ever heard that anyone say that before.
I personally, based on my experience and observations and all of that, I believe I'm going to use the 80/20 rule because that's kind of works in life. I would say 80% of the time, virtual meetings at this point in time in my industry, what we're doing, feel, seem, and are more effective than in office. But there's the 20% outlier. So it's nothing's ever absolute, right? The 20% of the time where the in-person meetings are good is, if I haven't had a personal connection with my team in a while and we need to do a lunch, or I want to do a workshop where we're whiteboarding, because if there are more than two people trying to whiteboard a concept, the Zoom whiteboards and the virtual like whiteboards, it kind of suppresses more involvement on the whiteboard just naturally because it's more complicated and to maneuver and you got somebody doing this and that and you're all over the place. But if you're in a conference room with people, I've noticed the instinct to be more involved in the visual management of a discussion on a whiteboard is way more effective in person. So like those workshops and everything, those are the 20%, right? The personal connection need where you're kind of like litmus testing the energy of your team and people seem kind of pretty run down or they need a little extra kind of connection on not just like, hey, we need to do this Zoom meeting tactic. Then I need to get in the office and I invite options of people in the office because I think anyone that is forced to do something is naturally going to be allergic to being forced to do something. And so I really try to keep that free thinking and flow going.
Yeah, that totally makes sense and it's smart on your part. I was thinking, when you were talking, Lisa, about perhaps younger technical people coming into organizations and they went through school and studied something technical and now they have a technical role and they think that them being proficient technically is what's going to carry them through. It's what's going to help them move up within organizations. And I found that that isn't always the case. In fact, in a lot of instances, that isn't the case, and that becoming an effective communicator is useful, if not mandatory, really, in moving up within an organization. What would your if you were counseling or advising a younger person, a younger technical person who didn't see the benefit of becoming a more effective communicator, a more effective communicator, what would you tell them?
You know, I think communication personally and professionally is extremely important because we live in a world where we're all connected and reliant and dependent on each other one way or another. Um, I think being technical, I think is very important to build a platform of accountability and credibility of how you solve problems, how you get work done. So it's not to be discredited, but I do think if the goal is to continue in rising your level of responsibility and your scope of what you are observing, of how you're solving problems within that scope, and that scope can increase. I do think that communication, and then I would also add, Neil, interpersonal skills. I think those two items are extremely important because we live in a world where we are so deeply connected to each other. And what somebody is doing has an impact on the work that we're doing. And I think it's important for us to understand how connected we are in everything. And so communication with one another. I mean, in our personal life, when we have problems, we go to a therapist, some of us do, to talk things out. Communication, right? And talk things out, not necessarily, but to get different perspective. Because sometimes our brains are telling us something and we get super anchored on that story and we lose sight of the different angles and points of view that could be considered. And we get so anchored in our thoughts that without that communication, we can't really break through that to know that there are options and variety, and to know about the dependencies of other people that are reliant on what we're producing. So,
When you were speaking, Lisa, it reminded me of a previous guest, and she worked as a programmer. And there was another programmer who sat not too far away from her. She could see him from her desk. When she'd look at him, he'd have on his desk a green cube and a red cube. And when the cube was green, you could talk to him. But when the cube was red, you had to leave him alone. And so when you were talking about interpersonal skills, it reminded me of that story, and just thinking about this other the other developer perhaps not thinking about the fact that he doesn't work in a vacuum, and that other people are dependent on him and he's dependent on other people. And even if you don't want someone to speak to you at a given time, they may have to speak to you at that time. And you have to have the
right.
self-awareness to understand that you don't get to dictate that.
Yeah, so the red light, green light, I've seen that in practice in the pre-COVID days when we were all in the office. And that's effective tool to create boundaries of silence, if you will, from the surround. I've seen people use it when they're on meetings. So like if you're in big open workspaces, right, and people are collaborating and discussing and talking, I've seen that be effective because if I'm in a meeting, right, I'm probably not going to be able to give my 100% focus in this meeting if I'm allowing people to reach me on the side, right? I do think, that creating a barrier of entry, or that's a negative way to say it, or a signal of when I'm available, right? If we flip it the other way, I think that can be effective. What I would challenge a person using it if they're not doing it for meetings, because meetings are pretty like classic. Like I can't talk. That's obvious. But if I'm like throwing a red light there and I'm sitting in the office because I have to get this concept done for like 6 hours and I'm not being available to anyone, um, I would tend to think that those like you should go find a safer space to not be so in like available where you're creating that kind of boundary of don't talk to me entry. If you need to do some like hardcore focus time, because I've done this myself, if I have to write a doc for my leadership, or if I have to do pretty aggressive analytics on talent management and trying to understand people's career trajectory and their performance, and I have to be super dialed in where me being interrupted all the time can lose my focus, right? I tend to put myself somewhere where I'm not as available because I know I can't be flexible to allow people to reach me all the time, right? I let people know what I'm doing. I'm going to be doing this for the next few hours. I'll let you know when I'm back available. I think the more people can communicate those boundaries in a work setting, I think the more effective they can be when they are available to folks or not available to folks.
Yeah, I could see that making sense, and you drawing that differentiator, and then I do like your idea of physically removing yourself. So now we're
I,
look where's Lisa? Well, Lisa must be pretty busy because I can't see Lisa right now. But if I
Well,
see Lisa,
but Neil, here's also where I really try to be inclusive. If I'm making myself not available, and I know people rely on me, I'm being self-aware. I know people rely on me, and at some point somebody might need me. Then I communicate, hey, I'm not going to be available for this chunk of time. I'm doing this. Um, I'll be back online. And I honestly, it's extremely rare unless like, there's a huge outage, which I'm getting paged by work systems anyways and getting interrupted, right? I can't think of any work experience where I put myself in that situation to create kind of safe boundaries because I have to get something done. So I'm not going to be available. I can't think of a situation where that created a negative outcome for people on my team.
yeah, yeah, I suppose that perhaps some people are find the red cube and the green cube off-putting, but just communicating your availability they don't find as off-putting. It's
Right.
just different stroke for different folks, I suppose.
I agree.
This has been a great conversation, Lisa. Thank you so much for being a guest. How could people stay in touch?
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah, how could people stay in touch with you?
How can you guys stay in touch with me? I'm on LinkedIn. You can look me up if you have any questions, ping me, shout. I love supporting perspective, discussions, dialogues, and helping people in their careers. I think the more we can surround ourselves around people that share different perspectives or are willing to communicate about their experiences, just the better we can become professionally learning through other people. So look me up on LinkedIn if you have any questions or you want to have a chat.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, and I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you can go to teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Lisa.
Bye.